All right. We're going to now move on to the next part of the afternoon, and we're going to start with a presentation from Mary Murphy, who's done some really interesting research particularly on the new intake of TDs into the Dáil. So we'll hear about that in a moment. But Mary is from UCC. UCC, as you all know, has contributed a lot to this convention through high-level academics. We've even won Clodagh on the academic and legal team. But what maybe some of you don't know is that we have a very distinguished convention member who has attained a significant honour. And yesterday, John Kenny was presented with a prize for the outstanding student in UCC last year. And he was so presented with that by the Taoiseach. And it's a great tribute to him. He's now in Oxford, where he's no doubt going to study with great distinction. But it's a particular pleasure to be able to acknowledge, if you like, one of our own, John Kenny. Stand up, John. So now, as you say, Mary, follow that.
I did teach him, though.
I'm the intern in my office as well.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the convention team for the invitation. As Tom mentioned, the invite presumably has been motivated by some of the work that I've done looking at first-time TDs. And that work in turn was motivated by the 2011 generation of TDs, because following the 2011 general election, we saw the largest ever intake of new TDs. So I set about to examine their experiences and talk to them about their perspectives, and we discussed ideas about Dáil reform as well. So I engaged directly with a number of them, and I mean, what I would say is that I was, in all sincerity, impressed by the new generation of TDs. They're a very hard-working lot. They have wonderful aspirations. They're committed, and they want to make Ireland a better place. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because when we talk about Dáil reform, although we're talking about an institution, we're talking about an institution which is composed of people. And they shouldn't be forgotten, I suppose, in terms of some of the arguments that we're addressing today. And I hope that doesn't sound too creepy when I say that I actually grew quite fond of them. But in any case, we're examining very big questions here today, and I was asked to talk about reform of Dáil Éireann and what the options for reform might be. So I decided to subtitle it The Choices and the Consequences. So one of the first things I thought I would address is just maybe to return to basics for a moment, and to question, well, do we need Dáil reform? We shouldn't necessarily start at the outset by proposing that Dáil reform is necessary. But in any case, advocates of Dáil reform believe a number of things, and some of them may be accurate, some less so, but I guess I leave it up to you to make up your mind as to the merit of these particular points. A lot of conversation about how the institution is not fit for purpose, and much of that was born out of this notion of Dáil Éireann constituting a dysfunctional parliament which facilitated the economic crisis, etc., etc. Of course, it didn't cause the economic crisis, but the argument is that it failed to adequately scrutinise and oversee political decisions and the actions of state institutions. There are those who suggest that the institution doesn't sufficiently hold the government to account, that it lacks the ability, the system lacks accountability, and that the Dáil has not been effective in accessing information and in interrogating the political and the policy process. Others might suggest that the institution does not contribute effectively to the legislative process. The parliamentarians are sidelined. They're simply used as a rubber stamp to approve government-sponsored legislative proposals. Their input is limited. At worst, this undermines the quality of legislation and maybe even begs questions as to the democratic legitimacy of the system. And then there are those who suggest that the institution is inefficient, that its manner of doing business is archaic, and that it's grounded in maybe unnecessary conventions and procedures. Now, regardless of your perspective on these questions, it's important to be aware that if we're to fix these problems, if we perceive them to be problems, that involves consequences, and that some of these consequences may be undesirable, or that they may in fact produce unanticipated effects. Now, parliaments themselves, and again, to sort of return to basics perhaps, parliaments are classified, in general terms, we classify parliaments along this, using these categories. So we would talk about active, reactive, and minimal parliaments. And Ireland, and I come from this as an academic, Ireland is classified as a weak, reactive legislature. Now, the consequence of this is that weak parliaments are associated with executive dominance. And in contrast, strong parliaments tend to be linked to weaker governments. Now, by weaker governments, I'm alluding to unstable governments, governments that don't necessarily go the full term. So there's a choice for us here. There's a choice that we have to consider. And the choice is, let's recognise and accept that Dáil Éireann fulfills two functions, two primary functions. One function is to sustain the government. And the other function is to scrutinise the government. Now, these functions aren't entirely compatible with each other. At present, the Irish parliamentary system prioritises sustaining the government. If you're to alter this balance, that will, of course, challenge executive dominance. But if you challenge executive dominance, you may undermine the stability of the system. So in other words, we may produce a scenario, if we're to tinker with this balance, we may produce a scenario where governments are no longer capable of serving a full term and of introducing their promised programmes for government, because the balance of power has shifted in the direction of Parliament. The question, therefore, that we face, and it's a very complex and a very difficult question, and it's one that is not easily addressed. The question is, do we ascribe primacy to the role for Parliament, which is focused on sustaining government, or do we advocate a stronger role for Parliament in scrutinising government, aware that this particular option may unsettle the stability of government? So it's not straightforward, I guess, is the key point to remember here. Now, what are the options in terms of addressing this particular challenge? And I've tried to, I've drawn on some of the discussions this morning and on some of the contributions from my colleagues, and I've tried to categorise what the options are. So the first one is, of course, constitutional amendment, change via referendum. Now, we did try that in relation to giving increased inquiry powers to committees. That was rejected. Some of the other options are, of course, strengthening the role of the Ceann Comhairle and inserting that into the Constitution and doing likewise in relation to the powers of committees. But I suppose what I would suggest is that political reform, and we can draw a distinction between political reform and constitutional amendment, political reform might be a more appropriate route to take, because political reform is about rebalancing power via internal institutional change, and particularly changes to standing orders. So it would be addressing the operation of the Dáil, maybe altering the roles played by key parliamentary figures, including the Ceann Comhairle, the role played by committees, and perhaps also asking parties to examine themselves in terms of their use of the whip system. A further category for change is institutional modernisation. And again, I draw a distinction between political reform and institutional modernisation. In a way, this is about practical and procedural changes to the day-to-day business of the House. This is maybe about making the Dáil a more convenient place to work, and perhaps a less frustrating place to work for parliamentarians as well. It would really involve challenging the organisational complexity of the organisation, of the institution itself. So amending the parliamentary timetable, perhaps, introducing a committee week, changing working practices, adopting family-friendly hours, but also greater use of IT in particular. And many of these changes have actually been introduced quite substantially since the 1970s in particular. Now, sometimes, of course, when we introduce changes of this nature, there is a danger that they actually sort of further solidify the imbalance of power between the government and Parliament, because they simply mean that you can get government-sponsored business through the House more quickly, for example. But once we're aware of that, that can be overcome. And then there's the whole question of cultural change, which is a different category again, and I know it's been mentioned a number of times today. And again, having engaged with the newest generation of TDs, I genuinely would be conscious of there being an element of cultural change and a change in mindset. The parliamentarians that we have today are full-time parliamentarians. Many of them come from professional backgrounds, and they are committed to the task in hand. And that brings it with it certain expectations about what they can do and what they should be doing. And I do genuinely believe that's evident. But in any case, cultural change, it's not readily achievable. You can't necessarily manufacture it by changing rules and regulations and procedures. But that being said, incremental change, modernisation and reform, these processes of change can over time alter mindsets and alter practices as well. But basically, cultural change is alluding to changing the atmosphere and the ambience of the House. And it may too involve refocusing members in terms of their ambitions and moving that ambition away from ministerial ambition and allowing them to carve out a rewarding parliamentary career. And that's not necessarily achievable at the moment. Being Speaker of the House, being Chair of a committee, it's not necessarily a privileged position in the way that it would be seen to be in other legislatures. And that, of course, cultural change, it requires political will and it requires political leadership. And what I mean by that is that TDs have to be enabled, they have to be empowered to embrace these new types, these new ways of thinking and these new types of behaviours. And unless there is acquiescence from the political leadership, that won't necessarily materialise. And I think too that we perhaps as voters, that maybe we have to alter our expectations of TDs. And allow them the room to engage more frequently with maybe their parliamentary roles than they do so far. So I'm sure I'm short on time, but let me just finish by maybe alluding in a little bit of detail to some of these points. The operation of the Dáil, lending greater independence to the role of Ceann Comhairle. I would see that as an important potential change, and one which could be manufactured and pioneered within the House itself. Giving more independence to this role would free up the legislative process, to some extent at least, and allow for greater parliamentary input. Reviewing how the Dáil sets its own agenda, and perhaps allowing Parliament greater input to that particular process, as per the Scottish example or the UK examples that we heard about this morning. Dáil committees are very important structures, and this is a quote from Philip Norton, where he suggests that legislatures exhibiting the greatest capacity to determine policy outcomes have highly developed committee structures. Parliamentary committees, they are the engine of Parliament in most and any parliamentary system. And let's be clear, Irish committees are not docile, and they certainly have developed over time. But they are dominated by government. Now, some of the possible reforms here might be changing the appointment process for committee chairs, incentivising committee membership, making it something that's worthy of being attained, and increasing the administrative support for committees. What we want are committees which are perhaps a little bit more outspoken and which have a capacity and an ability to criticise government where that's warranted and where that's needed. The Subcommittee on Dáil Reform hasn't been the most inspiring of committees in relation to its particular portfolio, and I think that's maybe a specific reform process which might be considered in terms of jump-starting this process. And the party whip system. Parties play an important role, and party whips play an important role and a necessary role in Westminster-style parliaments. They ensure that business proceeds and they ensure that decisions are made. That being said, however, very tight party management in Dáil Éireann probably does limit the capacity of the institution. Now, the possible reforms here are pretty tricky. a more flexible whip system. This is tricky because it has to be pioneered by parties themselves, and it's also tricky because where do you strike the balance? Parties also control this dimension of Dáil activity, and it's a feature of their operation which they hold very dear. And as I say, it does play an important and a necessary function. But again, some of the reforms that we might consider would be some limited use of the free vote under certain circumstances, for example. More robust debate and interrogation of legislation among TDs as well. And, you know, a type of engagement that's not a challenge to government, but that is all within a broader constructive context of producing better legislation. It engages TDs to a greater extent, and I would suggest too that it gives them a greater sense of fulfilment and rewarding, a greater sense of fulfilment and reward. And it also means that they're talking about important things, that they're not necessarily feeding that stereotype where they are viewed unfairly, I would believe, as being focused on a sort of a ritualistic form of antagonistic point scoring. So let me finish. Parliament matters, and our Dáil Éireann matters very much. It is the primary institution of the Irish state. It is a key source of political legitimacy in Ireland. And again, I'm echoing what Minister Fitzgerald was saying. And I didn't write this before you said it, or I did write this before you said it. Ministers take Parliament seriously. It does play a central role in the governance of the state, and we must recognise all of that. It has reformed itself over time, and it has changed over time. I would argue that a small number, possibly minor reforms, might actually produce some important and fundamental changes. They may produce not just institutional modernisation and political reform, but also attitudinal and behavioural cultural change among parliamentarians themselves. And that's more conducive to better policy outputs and an enhanced scrutiny role for parliaments. But let me emphasise, there's no holy grail here. There is no perfect model, and there is no idyllic parliamentary arrangement anywhere in the world. We must make our own choices. And those choices must suit our specific needs, the national interest, and they must acknowledge the external environment as well. Change has come. It has been slow and incremental. It hasn't been radical, but change has certainly come. This institution, Dáil Éireann, today in 2014, is a very different institution to what it was 30 or 40 years ago. And I would argue it's a better institution. This forum and this convention now provides us perhaps with something of an opportunity to make it even better again. So I wish you well in that endeavour.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. You know, the very first day we met in Dublin Castle on the 1st of December 2012, I said in my opening remarks, I noted the cynicism, public cynicism about politics and politicians. And I said it was dangerous for our society and corrosive of our democracy. And I hope that the convention in its work has begun to do something about that cynicism. But Mary's point at the very beginning of her speech about, you know, the deep commitment of politicians that she encountered in the 2011 intake to the public good, I mean, it's something that just does need to be stated and restated.